Father in heaven, I pray that you would give us wisdom and grace, that you would guide as we cover this material, and give us understanding. These can be some challenging issues. I just appreciate the promise of your presence and blessing now. And in Jesus' name, amen. So there's some very interesting religious liberty developments these days. The Supreme Court handed down, so the title here, Trinity of Trouble, I'll just say refers to at least two trinities. The first one being a Supreme Court decision in a case called Trinity Lutheran Church in Missouri. So the Trinity, it is the Trinity case. And the second Trinity is the Trinity of the baker, the florist, and the wedding photographer. The three who have been told, you need not carry on your business if you won't provide services for same-sex weddings. And the Supreme Court recently agreed to take the case of the baker, Masterpiece Bake Shop in Colorado. So we had three state Supreme Courts that ruled that discrimination laws restrict the religious freedom of the baker, the florist, and the wedding photographer. So we've got two trinities, and we're going to look at challenges to the wall of separation between church and state and some other issues. So, Ellen White said famously that when our country shall repudiate every principle of its Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, the end is near. It occurred to me years ago when I began this ministry that there was a big difference between what Ellen White meant by America as a Protestant nation and what we popularly hear from the religious right, America as a Christian nation. And I think if we're going to understand the prophetic context, so, if you will, framework, my sermon, we are looking at the application of the cross and the principles of the cross to religious liberty. Here, we're looking at the prophetic implications. It has been argued by some on the liberal wing of the church that Adventists only care about religious liberty because of our eschatology, which of course the liberals reject. I vehemently disagree. I believe, with A.T. Jones and Ellen White and the Bible, I would say that religious liberty is essential to the gospel itself, and that's the reason why we care so much. But if you ask your rank and file Adventist, what they understand by religious liberty, they'll mutter something about Sunday laws. And our depth of understanding is pretty shallow. We need to understand our historical roots if we're going to be able to see the prophetic implications of what's going on. And certainly if we're going to be able to resist the overwhelming deception, we have to have a context. So I'm going to do a little bit of context first before we look at the developments. So Adventists understand that the second beast here in Revelation 13 represents the United States. I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. The problem that I have with too much of what passes for Adventism these days is that we know the interpretation and we don't know the text and we don't know the meaning of the text. So we've read Ellen White, we've read Great Controversy, so we know what this is talking about, but we really don't understand it. Two horns like a lamb. What do horns represent? What do they symbolize? Power. Now, if you think about it, Daniel 7 and 8, the medieval church representing the consolidation of civil and religious authority was represented by a single little horn. Here, we have two horns. Two horns symbolically would suggest a separation of power. So when we look at the Protestant and Republican principles of our country, and of course the two horns are said to be what is lamb-like about our country, right? And the lamb we know is a symbol of Christ. It does not say, the prophecy does not say that America is a Christian nation. America is portrayed as a beast. And I've said for years, ladies, that all men are not beasts, but all nations in prophecy are. But the unique thing about America that is not so much beast-like but Christ-like is the separation of power, of civil and religious authority, with the separation of church and state, but also the very principle of the separation of powers. Now, there are two types of separation that the Constitution doesn't mention. The phrase separation of powers is not a phrase that's in the Constitution. It's what the Constitution does, not what it says. The separation of church and state is what the First Amendment does, not what it says. How do we separate powers? Well, we have the three branches of government, right? The Congress, the federal courts, and the Supreme Court, and then we have the executive branch and the presidency. But we also have a separation between federal, state, and local government. And believe me, as an attorney, I run into these issues all the time. We have cases against, employment discrimination cases against the federal government. We can't apply state law. The feds are not governed by state law. They're only governed by federal law. In California, we have better state laws than the federal laws, but they're useless to us when we're dealing with federal employees. There's a separation of powers, right? And then, local government also has certain powers that the state or the federal government can't interfere with. The genius behind this, of course, was the basic premise that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that by separating powers that you prevent the consolidation of power that can lead to the oppression of our civil and religious freedoms. The whole genius of this was to protect our civil and religious freedom, to separate powers among the branches and to separate the civil and the ecclesiastical authority. Okay? Now, this business of speaking like a dragon, my dear, dear friend Cliff Goldstein, in his book Between the Lamb and the Dragon, I think expressed a fairly common Adventist point of view that, there's something like a comma between, two horns like a lamb and speaking like a dragon. That comma represents a certain historical gap in time between the establishment of our Constitution on these lamb-like principles and the erosion of them where we enact Sunday legislation and become oppressive and dragon-like. The problem with that interpretation is a very simple one. It's textual. What tense is the word spake in? And in any translation that you will find, it's in the past tense. It's not future. And if you just think about American history for a moment, that makes all the sense in the world, because the tension, the struggle between these Christ-like ideals and principles that are espoused in our founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all people are created equal, and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That was a wonderful sentiment, but it was not put into place at the time that it was espoused, was it? It took 100 years to eliminate slavery, and another 100 years, or 80 years, and another 100 years to eliminate Jim Crow laws, and to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and to start to actually implement the notion that all of us are created equal. It took more than, 130 years for women to get the right to vote. And shall we start talking about the treatment of Native Americans or every generation of immigrants that has come to this country? I like to go speak at our Spanish churches in the West, in California. And one of the things I love to say to the Spanish folks is, don't think you're special. Our nation has treated every generation of immigrants just as badly as it's treating you. I'm Jewish. My Jewish forebears were not welcome to this country. They were treated very badly, as were the Irish, the Italian Catholics, and the Chinese. Name an immigrant. I mean, maybe the first immigrant groups, English and Germans, and some of the French Huguenots. Maybe they had it a little better, but after that, everybody has been in the same boat. We have been speaking as a dragon. There's always been this tension between these Christ-like principles that our nation was founded upon and our failure to live up to them. And the spirit of the dragon. That has been the story of our country. The prophecy could not have described it more eloquently, more accurately than it has done so briefly, so concisely. The prophecy continues. He performs, referring to the American beast here, he performs great signs, even makes fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men, deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do on the earth, to make telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the first beast, the one that was wounded by the sword and lived, which we understand to be the medieval church. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And so now, we see more overt dragon-like conduct where civil and religious authority are combined to persecute those who do not engage in an idolatrous form of worship. Now, when I'm presenting this to general audiences, I'm not interested in talking about other churches and other religions. That's really unnecessary. It's enough for us to notice here, in the Bible, any other worship than the worship of the Creator is a form of idolatry, is it not? And this clearly identifies the worship of the beast, which is a human power, whether you identify it or not. It is a human power. It is something other than the Creator of the universe. And so this is an idolatrous form of worship. And here you have the civil authority being employed to punish religious dissenters who refuse to engage in an idolatrous form of worship. Is that pretty clear? So we have a collaboration between church and state. The beast with lamb-like horns, a civil power, punishes those who dissent from the civil religion with both economic sanctions. They are excluded from the marketplace on account of their faith, something that happened to the Jews in Germany in the 1930s, and then subjected to capital punishment. So I've often thought that Germany in the 30s is an interesting foretaste of what is to come. All right, what makes America Protestant? Ellen White writes in The Great Controversy that to protect liberty of conscience is the duty of the state and the limit of its authority in matters of religion. Every secular government that attempts to regulate or enforce religious observances by civil authority is sacrificing the very principle for which the evangelical Christians so nobly struggle. I will put in a plug right here for you to go on Amazon or wherever you buy books and Google the name of Nicholas P. Miller, our friend and colleague at Andrews University, who's done the seminal work tracing the doctrines of the Reformation to the First Amendment. And he was doing his graduate work at Notre Dame, and it was so good that Oxford University Press published it. You would ask me that. I'm not on the internet, and I'm bad with titles, but if you... Religious Roots of the First Amendment. Thank you, Fred. In the Great Controversy, Ellen White points out, quotes the Protestant historian Merle d'Aubigné, a Huguenot French Protestant, and tells the story, I think it's chapter 11, about the protest of the princes. And you will recall that there was an attempt to restrict the progress of the Reformation. There was a council that was assembled to impose a decree upon the German princes that embraced the teachings of Luther. And the decree was designed to do two things. Number one, it would restrict the preaching of the Reformed gospel to those areas that had already embraced it. So it was a geographic restriction. And it would do something else. It would restrict any new theological reforms. So it was a doctrinal restriction as well. And the German princes gathered and weighed whether they would accept the decree, the ones who had embraced the teachings of Martin Luther, the Reformation. And they rejected the decree, and they drafted this document called a protest, which gave the very name Protestant to the Reformation. And they explained as the basis of their rejection that they could not accept these restrictions on religion, on religious freedom, because in matters of conscience, the majority has no power. And Ellen White, I think rightly, goes back to this protest for what d'Aubigné himself calls the essential principles of the Reformation. Now, to be sure, the Reformers compromised because of the chaos, the doctrinal chaos that the Reformation produced. And the practical result was the premise that the religion of the people would be the religion of the prince. And if the prince were Lutheran, the people were Lutheran, whether they wanted to be or not. And if the prince was Catholic, the people were Catholic. And that's just the way it was. It was really some of the dissenters, the Anabaptists. They were found to be persecuted for baptizing not infants, but people who had come of age and could make a personal commitment to faith in Jesus Christ. And, it didn't take too many drownings before they began to wonder whether the state had any legitimate authority to be resolving these sorts of doctrinal disputes. And since when does the state decide that we're wrong and they're right? And they began to understand and articulate these concepts of the separation of church and state, of limits on the authority of the state in religious matters. And it's these kinds of concepts that derive directly from the core teachings of the Reformation. Sola Scriptura, the Bible and the Bible only. It's the rule of faith and practice. Grace, salvation by grace alone, through faith alone. The priesthood of all believers. The principle that was established, even if it wasn't implemented in Europe, the established principle was really that neither the church or state had any right or authority to interfere between the soul and Christ. Neither the church or the state, because salvation, though Noah, Daniel, or Job were in the land, right? It's between you and your Maker. The church doesn't save you. The church doesn't control your conscience. The state doesn't save you. The state can punish you, they can persecute you, but not legitimately, not for your faith or even for your lack of it. And those were the principles deriving from the Reformation that were transmitted to the First Amendment. And not just to the First Amendment, but to all of the state constitutions. Because they all had their own constitutional provisions as well. At the founding, during the period of the 1880s and 90s, when the Adventist religious liberty work was established by the likes of A.T. Jones, they were facing potential Sunday laws. And Jones testified before the Senate committee. If you haven't seen it, in the 5-part History of the Sabbath documentary series, they do a marvelous reenactment of several minutes of Jones' testimony. And it's beautifully done. I think it's either part 4 or 5. I can't recall right now. Very well researched and documented. We had a lot of, they had a lot of original materials to go from. But Jones was very committed to what he saw as Protestant principles: individuality in religion, the rights of conscience, the separation of church and state as a Protestant principle, the incompetence of the state when it came to matters of religion, and of course, as we already established, religious freedom as an integral part of the third angel's message. And I suspect, I was asking, and I may be on the right track here, it occurred to me as I was thinking about presenting here, the great controversy is mostly history. And Jones was the leading historian at the time. And I'm told that Ellen White certainly consulted with Jones about the history that she reported, she wrote in the Great Controversy. And Jones, of course, wrote voluminously, so voluminously that you might have trouble getting through some of his writings. I confess that I have had such trouble at times. Okay, so we talked about this. So the Trinity Lutheran case, at its heart, is about government funding of the church. And so I want to recover some historic materials about government funding of the church from our founding generation. One of the foremost advocates of religious liberty within the faith community in colonial America were Baptists. Isaac Backus in Massachusetts, John Leland in Virginia. Hymn number 448 in our hymnal, "O When Shall I See Jesus," was written by John Leland, who famously urged James Madison to work for a Bill of Rights and amendments to the Constitution protecting religious freedom. I'm going to read a little bit of Isaac Backus's work. I think the title is given here somewhere, "An Appeal to the Public for Religious Liberty." "Now 'tis well known that this glorious head made no use of secular force," referring to Christ, that is, "in the first setting up of the gospel church, when it might seem to be peculiarly needful, if ever. And it's also very evident that ever since men came into the way of using force in such affairs, that is, in church affairs, their main arguments to support it have been drawn from the old Jewish constitution and ordinances. And what work has it made about the head as well as members of the church? Well, first they moved Constantine, a secular prince, to draw his sword against heretics. But as all earthly states are changeable, the same sword that Constantine drew against heretics, Julian turned against the Orthodox. However, as the high priest's sentence in the Jewish state decided matters both for prince and people, the same deceitful philosophy that had gone so far never left plotting till they had set up an ecclesiastical head over kingdoms as well as churches, who, with Peter's keys, was to open and shut, bind and loose, both in spiritual and temporal affairs. You see, Adventists did not come to our views about the medieval Catholic Church in isolation. We came by them honestly, didn't we? In historical circles today, it is no longer fashionable to refer to the Dark Ages. That was a Protestant view of history, which has been largely abandoned among historians today. Well, Isaac Backus, a Baptist, a Protestant, continues, but after many generations had groaned under what does he call it? This hellish tyranny, a time came when England renounced that head and set up the king as their head in ecclesiastical as well as civil concernments. And though the free use of the scriptures, which was then introduced by a divine blessing, produced a great reformation, yet still the high places were not taken away. Reference to the places of idolatry in Scripture where children were sacrificed, etc. And the Lord bishops made such work in them as drove our fathers from thence into America. So, very Protestant view of history. Now, what were the things that the Baptists were objecting to? They were objecting that the state had no authority to punish dissenters. They had no authority to tax to support the church or teaching of religion, that the genius of the American arrangement between church and state is the principle of voluntarism in matters of religion and respect for liberty of conscience. Voluntarism. So the Baptists were objecting not only to paying taxes to support, so in Massachusetts, each town had its church. They were congregational, and the preacher was selected by vote of the members, the people in the town, the men. And, for many generations, the preachers were primarily, Orthodox, Puritan type ministers. Until, and at that time, the Baptists first objected to paying taxes to support somebody else's church. And in some towns, they said, well, okay, we'll let you pay your taxes to support your own church. And the Baptists objected to that as well. They insisted that religion be entirely voluntary, based on these principles of liberty of conscience, based on their understanding of the gospel. So, taxation to support religion, government funding of religion, was a core issue when it came to that difficult phrase, establishment of religion, which we find in the First Amendment. What's difficult about it is that we're so far removed from the historical context that we wouldn't know an establishment if it bit us in the foot. We don't know what that means. But tax support of religion was basic to the types of colonial establishments that there were. So Backus continues, some professed Christians have imposed new taxes upon people on purpose to compel them to support their way of worship, and have blended in with other rates and then called it all a civil tax. But as the act itself is deceitful, so 'tis likely that the worship supported by such means is hypocrisy. And Ben Franklin quipped similarly that if God did not see fit to support the church to where people needed tax support, it was a good indication that maybe it was a bad religion. It's a paraphrase, but that's the gist of it. He's much wittier in his expression. Now, who can hear Christ declare that his kingdom is not of this world, and yet believe that this blending of church and state together can be pleasing to him. So Backus, of course, makes religious arguments against tax funding of the church. So Thomas Jefferson famously wanted to be remembered for three things on his tombstone. The Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom was one. Anybody remember the other two? Declaration of Independence and University of Virginia. Very good. So I'm going to give you the operative language of the statute first. That was enacted in 1786. It was first drafted almost a decade earlier, but in the heat of war was left to sit on the back burner. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to do what? To frequent, which is to say to attend regularly, or support, i.e. money, right? Any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods. So body, you can't, make somebody go or come. You can't restrain them, prevent them from going to church or make them go to church, or restrain them or compel them with respect to their goods, their possessions, their resources, their finances. Nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So you see, finances are a key part of this religious freedom as Jefferson understood it back in colonial, in the early days of our nation. This is the preamble, or a part of the preamble. And, we're going to read it because it really behooves us at the point where we are losing our bearings in our Constitution to go back and recover our constitutional roots. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do. That the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. And then he adds this following quip about money. That to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is, what does he call it? Sinful and tyrannical. You don't tax people to support something they don't believe in. Well, the other day I posted on my Facebook page about how it was the 200th birthday of Henry David Thoreau, who spent a night in jail for refusing to pay the poll tax. And I had two different accounts. One was because he refused to support the institution of slavery. The other was that he refused to support the Mexican-American War. I'm not sure if only one of those or maybe both of those is true. But, this idea of liberty of conscience when it comes to not taxing to support religion. This is basic. It was basic to the Baptists. This is what Jefferson was most proud of in enacting the Virginia Statute. Now, in order to get the statute passed. James Madison was the one who maneuvered it in the legislature. Jefferson was in France at the time. He was serving as ambassador to France. He was not even in the fray in Virginia. He'd written the bill almost a decade earlier. Patrick Henry had introduced a bill in 1785 that would have provided funding for the church and for the teachers of religion, and Madison succeeded in getting it put over to the next year, and then also getting Henry elected to governor. So he was out of the House of Burgesses and out of harm's way, so he could push through. And he organized, there were literally dozens of petitions, memorials signed by Presbyterians, by Baptists, by different groups, opposing Henry's approach and ultimately leading to the enactment of Jefferson's bill. Now, if it's very well worth taking the time to read, maybe it's 10 or 12 pages at most. If you Google Memorial and Remonstrance, it's easy to find on the web. This is one of the very finest documents ever written on the subject of religious freedom, Madison's Petition that he wrote that led to the enactment of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And I'm just excerpting a very small bit of it that's relevant to our discussion today. Because it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. Now, this 3 pence, this may seem like an arbitrary, trivial amount, kind of a rhetorical flourish from our perspective a couple of centuries later, but 3 pence was in fact the amount of tax that certain Baptists refused to pay on their property to support the Congregational Church, and they lost their property on conscience grounds for refusing to pay a 3-penny tax. So this brings us, before I let you look at the slide, let me set up the case. Because the facts of the case, we lawyers have a fond way of saying that bad facts make bad law. Well, these facts are very troubling in terms of trying to make a good precedent out of them, and in fact, they led to a bad precedent. State of Missouri, they had a program with some limited funding to pay for organizations, preschools, and the like to purchase used tires to turn them into playground surfaces to protect the safety of little kids. Sounds like a great program. And the Trinity Lutheran Church there had a preschool. It was not a separate preschool, it was part of the church. They applied as part of this program. They were recognized as being qualified, well qualified. I think they were number 5 in rank in terms of their qualifications, meeting all of the criteria for participating, except that the Missouri Constitution, like that of 38 other states, does not allow for tax funding of any churches. And so they were excluded. The 2 lower courts that heard the case upheld the application of the Missouri Constitution and said, we don't fund churches in America. There's no problem with what Missouri did. But the church and its backers among the far right were insisting that they had suffered discrimination and that they were excluded from this program simply because they were a church and that they were discriminated against, that they were otherwise qualified and should have been included. Well, Justice Sotomayor, I think, got it right in her analysis. To hear the court tell it, this is a simple case about recycling tires to resurface a playground. The stakes are higher, she says. This case is about nothing less than the relationship between religious institutions and the civil government, that is, between church and state. The court today profoundly changes that relationship by holding for the first time that the Constitution requires the government to provide public funds directly to a church. Its decision slights both our precedents and our history, and its reasoning weakens this country's long-standing commitment to a separation of church and state beneficial to both. Now, there's some steps here. We went from a tradition of no funding to the church. We jumped over the step of funding the church is permissible to funding the church is required. All in one step. And in the analysis, the court's decision does not even discuss the Establishment Clause or its history. It treats this as a free exercise case, that they were somehow discriminated against in violating their free exercise of religion. Well, they weren't coerced in any way to do or not do anything based on their religion. They were free to have their playground. They were free to purchase rubber tires if they thought that was a better surface than the one that they had. They were perfectly free. The government wasn't restricting or preventing their free exercise in any way. And yet the free exercise clause required the state to include them in this program. The implications of this decision are extremely broad. The first thing that happened on the same day is that the court sent, I think it was 4 voucher cases back for further deliberations from the appellate courts in light of this decision. So I suppose if a state has any kind of funding program that includes private schools, they can't exclude religious schools, or that's kind of the direction the court's going. I don't know how far they're going to go. In California, we have a grant program for college students, a state grant program called Cal Grants. Is the court going to say, well, you can't fund the private school students at a lower rate than you fund the public school students? I mean, I just don't know. The other problem is that if you can't treat the church differently than secular institutions, what about all the protections and exemptions that we enjoy? In California, you cannot, we have very broad discrimination laws, including sexual orientation, but you cannot sue a church under California discrimination law. We have an exemption. And Claude Morgan, our not my direct predecessor, he served in the Sacramento office of the Church State Council for about 15 years back in the 70s and 80s. Claude went and testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in California and argued the separation of church and state, and they bought it. And that's why we have this religious employer exemption from the Fair Employment and Housing Act, because of the separation of church and state. But if these laws collapse, if the 38 state laws are really not valid and constitutional provisions that restrict government funding of the church, I don't know what really remains of the Establishment Clause and what the status of the church is anymore. within America. This is as much of an upset to the separation of church and state as the peyote case was that destroyed free exercise. I'm not going to give a huge refresher on that, but the peyote case said if you have a law that is neutral in its language, religiously neutral in its language, and applies across the board, it's generally applicable. There's no religious exemption. There's no free exercise exception from these kinds of laws. The context was religious use of peyote. Others have made claims to religious use of marijuana. Well, the courts rejected those. Now they don't need to make religious claims. When it comes to marijuana, they just have to move to Colorado or Washington or at least go vacation there, right? This was just handed down early July, just before the 4th, or was it the end of June? It was right at the end of the term. Okay, so this is, it's kind of too soon to tell just what the scope is, but, to some of us, direct funding of the church is fraught with all kinds of difficulties. Now, for one, just take the most direct and obvious. So let's say the church got, $10,000 to go buy used tires, and they go to the used tire guy, and the used tire guy says to them, "Oh, you're a church, I'm going to donate them." And the church graciously accepts the donated tires and installs the playground equipment, and then, they have all kinds of other financial needs, and rather than returning the funds, they use the funds for something else. Well, you can see that obviously the giver of the funds, the state of Missouri, has an obligation to audit the church. Well, we have these ideas of non-entanglement of church and state. That's a core principle of the Establishment Clause. But, we also have a basic principle of accountability. If you're going to give money for whatever purpose, the government's spending money, they're accountable to the citizens for the use of those funds. And we moan and groan all the time about how our tax dollars are misspent, and rightly so, and we want accountability. And certainly there is the right to be accountable for the use of those funds, which may mean the government also intruding on all of the books of the church. There was a lawsuit against the Catholic Church by a pro-abortion group that wanted to prove that the Catholics were violating their tax-exempt status through their advocacy of pro-life. And the court did not allow discovery, did not allow an intrusion on the records, the internal records of the Catholic Church, because of the separation of church and state. So if the separation of church and state, goes into the scrap heap of history, then the church is treated like any other corporate entity and has no more protections necessarily or independence of government regulation and control than any other business or entity. We're treated the same as everybody else. And that would be a very concerning situation. Are we there yet? Well, there was a footnote that only 4 of the justices signed on to that suggested that this wasn't just opening the floodgates for funding in other contexts, but was limited to this particular one. But there's been vigorous discussion among the con law professors. There's a listserv of Google groups that I'm part of the law professors dealing with religious freedom issues, and there's been a lot of discussion about, well, it was only a minority who said that it didn't apply broadly. And then they send back these voucher cases. So we just don't know, is the short answer. But the implications are very, very troubling. So that's the Supreme Court. For starters, The next subject we're going to talk about is one that if you have been getting a lot of your news and information from Fox and other conservative sources, you're going to be very surprised at what I'm going to say. Because what you've been hearing from the conservative side of things is how the free speech of the church has been restricted by something called the Johnson Amendment that prevents us from endorsing candidates. And the Adventist Church, along with every other denomination in the United States, opposes the repeal of the Johnson Amendment. There is no denomination that wants to have our pastors endorsing political candidates in our pulpits. Okay? Now, it's at its heart, it is not a free speech issue. Okay? It's really about funding. And let me explain. It's very simple. Politics in this country is done with after-tax dollars. You want to support a candidate? You can, but you've already paid taxes on those donations, on that money that you're giving for that candidate. If you're a corporation and you want to fund, those dollars are after-tax dollars, not pre-tax dollars. But as we all know, for those of us who itemize deductions, the dollars that we give to the church are tax deductible. They're pre-tax dollars. There is tremendous appeal to be able to fund politics with pre-tax dollars and to use the churches as an arm of the political party. So, is there also motivation drawn from the history of the black church in America that has been very outspoken politically for generations? Yes. And guess what? The black churches have not had their wings clipped with their political speech, and with one exception, neither have the white churches that have tended to be very supportive of Republican candidates. The one exception was when Randall Terry of Operation Rescue fame ran an ad in 1992, and I forget the exact details of it, but it was an attack ad on Bill Clinton. And it was under the auspices of, I'm forgetting the name of the church there in New York State that sponsored the ad. That was the lone time when the political activity was so blatant and public that the IRS finally took action. There was a sort of lame investigation of a liberal Presbyterian church in Pasadena some years later. I think that was primarily for a political show. Having cracked down on a conservative church a decade earlier, they felt the need to at least make a show of being even-handed and scrutinizing a progressive church that was promoting Democratic candidates. But frankly, the only functioning part of the Johnson Amendment is the idea that we're not turning our churches into political action committees and using them to really quite overtly fund political campaigns. And we need to just be clear the distinction between candidates and issues, because the Johnson Amendment does not preclude us from talking about issues, whether we're pro-life or pro-choice, whether we're pro-gay rights or anti-gay rights, whatever our issues may be, whether we're pro-legalization of marijuana or against legalization, or whatever the issue is. And I'll give you my disclaimer again. I'm not here to preach politics. We've got to be very careful about keeping politics out of the pulpit. you know, because the pulpit is sacred and we have a different mission and obligation. And the churches that oppose repeal of the Johnson Amendment, they do so because they are jealous of the sacredness of the pulpit. They don't want the pulpit to be used and abused for partisan political purposes. Now, I have long advocated that we build good relationships with our elected officials. And let me just tell you for 2 minutes how I think that can and should be done. First of all, after people are elected, long before they're running for re-election, we should be inviting them to church and inviting them even to address our churches. The best practice I saw was when Washington Johnson was pastor in Oakland, and he had the city council member come. They had a podium that was set up on the floor, not up on the platform. And they had a time period between Sabbath school and church that was separate and apart from the divine hour. And they had an interaction with the city council member, and she took 5-10 minutes to speak to the church, and the pastor introduced the church to her and expressed something of who they were, their concerns for the community, and it was a very nice feature in between Sabbath school and church. And she was invited to stay for the service and for a special luncheon and that sort of thing. But it was not part of the worship service. But it was an opportunity to get acquainted. We had an Adventist serving in the California legislature for many years. We had him come and speak for a conference up at the Adventist camp at Leone Meadows. Anybody here ever been to Leone Meadows? I love Leone Meadows. It's a wonderful place up in the Sierras. And I asked him, his name is also Alan, I said, Alan, have you ever been prayed for in an Adventist church? He said, no. And I said, well, have you been prayed for in other churches? He said, in many other churches. And we had special prayer for him. Now, his politics and mine differed. But he's always been very gracious to me, to the church. I wasn't praying for him because I liked or disliked his politics. I was praying for him because he felt called by God to public service. And I wanted God to bless his public service. And I think we can build those friendships with people regardless of their politics. Now, there is a bill that we're opposing right now in California. The author of the bill is a Latina woman attorney who is very outspoken in support of workers' rights and many other issues. So we got acquainted with her. I heard her speak, and I took my legislative director to hear her speak, and that gave him some ideas, and he's reaching out to her staff and hoping to meet with her, not to talk about the issues that we disagree with in the bill that we're opposing, but to look at issues where we can find common ground. Because even with your enemies, if you try hard enough, you can find areas where you can agree. And we need to do that and build these bridges with the leaders in our communities. We harbor, when it comes to us and them, like I was preaching earlier, one of the attitudes that we all tend to be guilty of is a bad attitude about politicians. And we tend to assume that their motives are, selfish and impure. Well, politics is a tough business. And, I've met some really stupid and bad politicians, but I've met an awful lot of them that are smart and dedicated. And even, and they may not agree with me, and that's okay. But I can see that they're wanting to do good things and wanting to be responsible. And we can work with people for the good of our communities. And we can show that we are also committed to the welfare of our communities. And when we do that and we build these relationships, then when there are issues in dispute, we will have a listening ear. Somebody that knows and respects us instead of us being complete strangers. And I suggest that I'm getting ahead of myself, but when it comes to the final crisis, that's going to be critical, that people are willing to listen. The Holy Spirit's responsible ultimately for whether they're convinced and converted. That's not anything that we can do, but we can open up opportunities, right? We can build bridges of friendship. So, recently, the House Appropriations Subcommittee efforts to repeal the Johnson Amendment have been stalling in Congress, so they decided to give direction to the IRS that they can't use any money to enforce the Johnson Amendment. Well, they're not really enforcing it now anyway, but this is very much still a concern in Congress. And frankly, the faith community that has the ear of the presidency are not representative of the denominations. They're representative more of kind of the non-denominational and independent Pentecostal and evangelical wings. And frankly, very strongly representative of the prosperity gospel wing of American Christianity, if you can call the prosperity gospel part of American Christianity. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit. How are we doing time-wise here? 30. Okay, not too bad. Yeah, and did some come in? Let me take a look. Maybe I'll take them sooner. Okay, good. So yeah, before we switch topics, this is very apropos. What should we think about tax money used to give students the opportunity to attend the private school of their choice, including our SDA schools, choice program in Wisconsin, opportunity scholarship in North Carolina, etc., voucher programs? So, problem number one. All of the Adventist schools taking the money are violating the law. Why do I say that? I can tell you without looking at the Wisconsin law or the North Carolina law that all of the voucher laws have certain requirements for the schools to be eligible. And one of those requirements is a generic non-discrimination requirement. Okay? Adventist schools discriminate on the basis of religion. And we're proud of it, and we should be. We insist that our faculty and staff be Adventists. And if they weren't, they wouldn't be Adventist schools. That's important. Now, we discriminate in a different way in admissions policy because we have different tiers of tuition, right? So if your kid is, if your family is a member of a constituent church of that school, you get the lowest rate of tuition. If in most places, I don't know if this is universal, this has been my experience, if your family is a member of a church somewhere nearby, but not a constituent, in other words, the church itself, and there's a reason for this. So, I mean, in terms of our own church budget, I think something like 1/3 or more of our church budget goes to support the schools that we're constituents of. Awful lot of our church budget in all of our churches goes for our elementary and our academies, right? And so the kids, from those churches that are already supporting, they get, consideration for that. They get a lower tuition rate. If you're in an Adventist church that's not contributing to that school, you get a higher tuition rate. And if you're in the community and not a member of any Adventist church, you may pay a higher rate still. Now, that may be perfectly fair and reasonable. I'm not criticizing the practice, but I'm saying that it is discriminatory because it is making distinctions based on your church membership. That would be considered a form of discrimination. It's in violation of the voucher statutes. We have not repealed the golden rule, friends. I don't mean Jesus' golden rule, the biblical one that says, do unto others. I mean the other golden rule. He who's got the gold makes the rules. So I have a very simple way of thinking about this issue, and at the risk of being insulting or whatever, I think it's a very clean way of thinking about it. What do we call schools that are funded by tax dollars? Public schools. So if we want our schools to provide the same kind of education as the public schools, then take the money. But if we want to provide a distinctive Christian education, we need to maintain our independence. Now, years ago, I had a discussion when I first came to the Pacific Union. One of my colleagues came back from a convocation of Hispanic youth, and he was very discouraged because none of them were in our schools. Like 3 hands out of hundreds of kids were in our Adventist schools. And he was very discouraged, and he felt that we needed to take the money if it would mean that more kids could get a Christian education. So I asked him this question. I said, what percentage of our members, not the ones who are on the books that don't show, but the ones who are in church fairly regularly, what percentage are paying a faithful tithe? Is it more or less than 50%? He said it was way less. And so I said to him, we don't have a financial problem, we have a spiritual problem. Because if those of us who cared enough to participate regularly in church, I'm not talking about those who are really tenuous, but if we were faithful, then we wouldn't have a financial problem. We'd have enough money so that every kid could have a Christian education and nobody would be excluded. Years ago, when I was living in the Hudson Valley in New York, our church was part of a 2-church district. The school was across the river, about a half an hour away, the other church. And the pastor came to all of us one by one and asked us, I think it was something like $30 a month he wanted from all the families in the church to support the temple plan so that they would not have to charge tuition. And all the kids who wanted could go to the school. And I laughed because I was paying exactly 10 times that for my property taxes. And I just felt it was totally appropriate for me to pay. And I was paying the property tax to support the public school system, and I was prepared to pay something to support our own schools. And you may or may not be aware, but whatever we may think about the spiritual condition of our schools, they are the lifeblood of the church. And that is where, I can tell you the difference between my kids who are in church and those who are not is those who went to church schools and those who left church school. And there's a lot more to it in terms of divorce and everything else. But I am a huge believer in the importance of church schools and maintaining them. One of my mentors was Lee Boothby. I don't know if any of you had the privilege of knowing Lee. He passed away, 2 years ago now? I was privileged to speak at his memorial. Lee was one of the early lawyers defending separation of church and state and defending our members with their Sabbath cases. And I had the privilege and opportunity to work with him on some things. And And Lee taught me, he litigated a number of cases before the United States Supreme Court, some of these church-state cases about government funding of religion. And one of the things he taught me was, if you want your church schools to secularize, it's very easy. You don't have to do anything. They will secularize. That's the natural drift of things. But if you want to maintain the spiritual foundation of the schools, it's hard work. You have to be very deliberate, very intentional. All right. Masterpiece Cake case is going to the Supreme Court. They will probably join with it. Arlene Flowers' case out of Washington, that cert petition is still pending, so there will probably be 2 of the 3. They did not take the first case, the New Mexico case involving the photographer. The photographer case actually was the better of the 3. Why do I say that? Because arguably neither the baker or the florist have a free speech claim. Neither case involved any kind of actual expression. Whereas photography, it's hard to deny that even wedding photography is first and foremost expressive art rather than, just providing a service. I think, the discussion, as much as you may say that arranging flowers or baking, designing a wedding cake is artistic expression. There's an argument there, but for the most part, I think it's a weak argument, and at least the law professors seem to agree that in terms of protecting this as expressive speech is a pretty weak argument, and they don't think it should prevail. Now, when you analyze these cases under the existing free exercise doctrine, they all deserve to lose. Why? Because what you have are neutral laws of general applicability. That's what these discrimination laws are. These are all public accommodations laws, the kinds of laws that say the restaurant can't turn somebody away and not serve them because they're black, right? Or because they're Jews. They have to serve all comers. Well, that's what these laws are, but they go far beyond the federal laws, which applied primarily to things like restaurants and transportation, hotels, that sort of thing. So you can have a place to sleep, a place to eat, you can travel. The federal laws would not have applied to mall stores, for example. If a mall store turned you away, that was never covered by federal law, but it is now covered by state laws. Okay? So under the prevailing, under the Smith case, it's called, these discrimination laws clearly do trump a claim of exemption based on religion. So the question is, will the court, in taking this case, reverse that precedent? Now, I've kept in this slide, which is, I'll confess, intentionally provocative. Because, I would, maybe I'm clairvoyant or something, but I suspect this is a rather conservative audience. That you would identify yourselves more as conservatives than liberals, okay? But let me just have your attention for a minute and let me define my terms. Liberalism is dedicated to maximizing liberty, okay? So by liberal, I mean freedom for people to disagree, to have differing values and beliefs within a civil society, okay? By illiberalism is about imposing one's conception of the moral good on society, restricting the freedom of dissenters. Okay? So, with that definition, and you don't have to answer the question about is Jesus a liberal or not, but where do we sit in the culture wars? So, my perception is the culture war is between competing illiberal worldviews. On the secular liberal side, you have a Darwinian materialist perspective and the religion of me. Rights are a product of power. Equality trumps religious liberty. It's not liberal. It's freedom for everybody but us, pretty much, right? Freedom to believe anything you want as long as what you believe doesn't matter. Right? You can believe just about anything you want, and that's fine. But when you believe that there is absolute truth, you're not equal. You're discriminated against. So the liberal view is not liberal. It is, in fact, illiberal. But on the far right, on the Christian conservative side, it is equally illiberal. It is, for too many Americans, the freedom to believe as I do. Not to believe differently, the freedom to believe as I do. That's true on both the left and the right. Well, Adventists are not the secular left. We're not. We don't believe, we differ in many ways, but neither are we the religious right. I have often described us as the lonely middle because we respect the rights of everybody, not just ourselves. Is it possible to coexist? It's becoming more and more difficult. And you need to understand, maybe you don't, but the perspective from the left. You see, my friends who are secular, for them sexual liberty has become a most prominent right, and they regard religion, at best, it's a benign myth, at worst, religion is violent and dangerous, right? And they not only see that in terms of Islam as, potentially violent and dangerous, but in terms of the history of Christianity as well, right? And there's certainly plenty of violence and war in the history of the church. And so their basic view is, why should myth trump personal liberty? That's what we have to overcome from the left. And so having the left agree that we should somehow have our religious freedom to dissent from same-sex marriage, dissent from the gay agenda, is a tough sell, very tough sell. And I'm very concerned that coexistence is very difficult. We're at a place in our culture where biblical beliefs about human sexuality and marriage are regarded as bigotry. What many of us believe as Christians is regarded as bigotry. Now, the Supreme Court declined to respect the right to practice such religious doctrines in the Obergefell decision. They paid lip service to our right to believe in traditional marriage, but they didn't go so far as to even give lip service to our right to act on those beliefs. And so whether our freedom to differ from the prevailing moral chaos, if you will, is certainly in doubt. So when I talk with some people who are advocates, and this is certainly not true of rank and file people that you meet who are, secular or liberal or even gay, but advocates are definitely quite determined to force the church to change its doctrine when it comes to human sexuality and marriage. Okay? So, we've been talking so far about the erosion of the Protestant principles. I'll just point out that the Republican principles, respect for privacy, for individual liberties, is also under assault, and there have been a number of books written about it. If you haven't been thinking about these issues, you may want to give some greater thought to it. We're kind of at the end of our time here, but certainly the national surveillance state is not consistent with our Republican principles. It just isn't. The Fourth Amendment says no, the state cannot protects every person's right to be secure in their persons and property from unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant that specifies the person, the place to be searched, the things to be searched for. It has to be specific. This, out in the desert south of Salt Lake City, the NSA has built a server farm that, they've got football fields sized warehouses of servers gathering up every scrap of digital voicemail, email, text, social media, you name it. The data that's being collected on you and me is extraordinary. The cover article of the Atlantic magazine a year and a half ago had a picture of a guy wrapped in tinfoil. Okay? And the article, the title was, "If you're not paranoid, you're crazy." As government agencies and tech companies, and mind you, your retail companies, the businesses that you do business with, they are after your data big time and your shopping habits and all of your demographic data to sell, and get you to buy more product. As government agencies and tech companies develop more and more intrusive means of watching and influencing people, the question is, how can we live free lives? Things are changing, folks. I would suggest to you that in many ways we are in an era that is challenging our concept of what a republic is, what freedom is, and our kids are not growing up with the same experience of freedom that we have and with the same values. They're accepting a level of intrusiveness that I hope still horrifies some of us. And so there are those who are questioning whether we are a republic anymore. If you can see those titles. And so I've been prone to observe that in the national security state, you are only free as long as you're irrelevant. Because if you stand up, if you, get your head out where the fire is, they're going to sit up and take notice and monitor you very carefully. And you better not have any skeletons in your closet because they'll be coming after you and using them to take you down, right? But of course, as Christians, we know there is already somebody who sees and hears everything we do, and so we stand naked before the Creator of the universe. And so we should not have anything to hide, but that doesn't mean that what we do still can't be twisted and distorted. Those who honor the Bible Sabbath will be denounced as enemies of law and order, as breaking down the moral restraints of society, causing anarchy and corruption, and calling down the judgments of God upon the earth. It's ironic that those who are foremost in advocating respect and obedience to the law of God will be the ones denounced as enemies of law and order. It's ironic, isn't it? How we live in a post-truth world. Right? That's kind of what Ellen White is describing here, is a post-truth world where things are turned upside down. Black and white are mixed up here. My question is, are we asking the right questions? Are we asking questions about things that are irrelevant, like how are the Sunday laws going to come, or maybe whether women should be ordained or not? Maybe those are relatively irrelevant questions. But if Ellen White and the Bible have given us any prophetic wisdom and insight, my question is, what are we supposed to do with what we know? And I would suggest to you this is a question that you don't just ask once and answer. It's a question that we keep asking. We keep asking, what is our church congregation to be doing in light of what we know? How do we relate to the community? Would the community even care if we folded up the church and went away? Do we count? I suggest that if we really expect persecution to come to our community, we need to be proactive now, become an essential part of our community, build ties with community leaders, be known as champions of liberty of conscience, but also as Christians who are actively serving in the community. And it doesn't have to be ministries that we develop within the church. We can participate in other services and ministries because we're not the only ones who care about our community. And by the way, when we go and join with others, we're going to meet people outside the church and have an opportunity. Well, who are you? I'm an Adventist. Well, what's that? And, build friendships. And you never know where those are going to lead. We think we have to do everything as distinct and separate instead of going and embracing and reaching out and being. The first rule of success, show up. Show up. Nothing happens until we show up. And I can tell you in my ministry, the Lord has blessed so many times when I just show up. I don't know why I'm there or what I'm supposed to do, but I have an open heart, an open mind, and I participate. I'm not a wallflower. Maybe you figured that out by now. One of the mottos of our church's religious liberty ministry is to make friends before we need them. And brothers and sisters, we need them. Time for questions. More questions. Okay. Now, here was one from before. Adventists resonate with other Christians that recognize that Christianity is under attack. And we want to, quote, take America back to God again. Okay? Our membership has had little guidance in terms of an appropriate response. Adventists are voting largely now with the religious right and see only Sunday laws as constituting religious freedom. What are the flaws in this thinking? Can your department produce material? I will have to give that last part some thought. Does the state have a role to play in taking America back to God? The historic answer in America is that the church is the institution in society charged with the moral and spiritual uplift of the people, not the state. And I would suggest to you that to the extent that the church is whining and groaning and moaning about the spiritual decline of our nation, they need to get the huge redwood-sized tree out of their own eyes and recognize that the church is primarily responsible. Because after all, God did not delegate to Madison Avenue or to Hollywood the responsibility for the morals of the nation. And so, Hollywood and Madison Avenue may be selling sex and violence and immorality, and that they have the freedom to do. But the American people are buying it, and they're buying it in spite of what, or maybe because of what they're hearing in church. Because they're not hearing anything in church to suggest that it's important to do otherwise. Okay, well, then we're stopping at 5. So I will stop. I would agree that Sunday laws are not the only religious liberty issue by any stretch. And as far as guidance, we have long lamented that our ability, as in religious liberty, to influence our churches pales in comparison to that of the likes of James Dobson and Pat Robertson and others in the religious right who keep telling us to vote Republican. And I'm not saying you shouldn't vote Republican. I'm just saying that, there are many good reasons to vote one way or the other, but we shouldn't just be in lockstep and buy this Christian America hogwash that's being dished out. Frankly, if there's anything left of a Protestant genius and ethos, it is that individuals can be Christian, not nations. And I've often said, I don't think we really want our country to live by the principles of the Sermon on the Mount. We don't want our nation to love our enemies and, turn the other cheek. Maybe you do, but you're probably in a minority if you do. I think mostly we're happier with Teddy Roosevelt's admonition to speak softly and carry a big stick and be prepared to stand up and fight for what we believe in as a nation. Now, Adventists historically are non-combatants. We don't believe in taking up the sword and killing people in combat, but that's another matter. We're going to close with prayer. I very much appreciate the privilege of sharing. You can see I don't care very deeply about these things at all, right? There's a reason why I've been at this for 24 years, and I'm not planning to give it up anytime soon. I'm very much enjoying the ministry that God has given. There are opportunities all the time to work both with the far right and the far left and everybody in between and other faith groups. And that's the most fun that I have is networking with, in the world with people of other faiths and leaders and other lawyers and representing the values of Adventist, respect for freedom for everybody, in that marketplace. And it's a privilege, and I'm thrilled that I get to do it and, even get to support my family doing it. So thanks to those in leadership here who invited me to be here. I would stay for the whole time, but I travel way too much and plan to be home with my family this weekend. So I'll be taken off in the morning. I'm going to come back this evening and what have you. But let's bow our heads for prayer. Father in heaven, we do live in times that try men's souls. And I pray you'd give us wisdom and perspective and understanding our nation's history and our church values and biblical values of religious freedom as we see these complex issues going before the courts and the Congress, and help us to understand how to represent you aright in advocating for freedom for everybody. In Christ's name, amen.